Well, let us begin. I'd like to welcome you to a panel discussion conversation tonight on gendering disability, rabbinic and reform perspectives. To begin, I believe I know almost everyone in this room. My name is Frank Kogan, Director of the Center, and myself and Ann Browdy, Director of the Program of Women's Studies and Religion, had the fond idea last year that we should do more things in common. We're across the lawn from one another, and looking for opportunities to work together, to have some programming together, collaborate on interesting projects. And it turned out that tonight we really have this wonderful opportunity to have a project in which together, naturally things come together. And so in this very topic, gendering disability enters the world of gender studies, sexuality, women's studies, and rabbinic and Reformation perspectives crosses religious and cultural boundaries. And so it's kind of a natural opportunity for us to have a conversation of this sort. I'll read you the little summation that we have before getting to introducing the speakers. This dialogue will examine the historical nexus of disability, gender, and religion in Jewish and Christian texts. We use rabbinic, medieval, and early modern sources to explore the constructed nature of disability and its spiritual, social, and sexual implications. Focusing on disability and the priesthood, we discuss how talmudic interpretation and papal dispensations both serve to undermine strict notions of disability as a limit to priestly service. We also engage the religious ideologies that shape masculine representations of women's disability in the context of marriage. So a lot of things woven together in that short paragraph. But before I say another word, I've welcomed you on behalf of the Center. I'd ask Ann Browdy to say a word of welcome also.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. It's great to see you all from my sabbatical hideaway that I could not resist coming out for this occasion, which I've looked forward to for a long time. And I will just add that throughout the fall term, when I had a chance to work with Julia and Michelle, it really became increasingly clear to me throughout the term the extent to which the category of disability illuminates the category of gender, which is the study of an embodied difference. And so I'm really grateful that they agreed to contribute to this conversation. I have a feeling that this is going to be, at least for me and for WSRP, the beginning of an arena that we are going to want to explore much, much further. So thanks for joining us, and thanks to Frank for sponsoring this.
Together. I think our speakers need no introduction, but I'll introduce them anyway. Anne could certainly do better, but maybe the perspective from reading from the page will be of some help in bringing out some certain insights. So we have two presenters, and then we hope to have a respondent who will introduce later on. So Julia Belser is Assistant Professor of Judaism in the Religious Studies Department at Missouri State University. She earned her PhD in the Joint Program in Jewish Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and the Graduate Theological Union. She received her rabbinic ordination from the Academy for Jewish Religion in California. She's co-authored a health handbook for women with disabilities, published by Hesperian Foundation, and distributed a book that's distributed to grassroots groups and health workers all around the world. Her poetry, her fiction, her essays have appeared in Midstream, a journal of Jewish thought, the Journal of Women and Religion, Calliope, a journal of women's art and literature, and Fireweed, a feminist quarterly. Julie is a scholar of rabbinic literature, and she brings feminist, queer, and disability studies perspectives to her analysis of the Babylonian Talmud. As a feminist ethicist, she crafts Jewish eco-feminist thought and environmental ethics in conversation with rabbinic and medieval sources. While here this year, she's working on her book, Narrative Dialectics, Theology and Ecology in Bavli Tanit. As a women's studies research associate, she is setting contemporary post-colonial queer, womanist, and feminist theories and poets in conversation with the Babylonian Talmud. Just in this room a few weeks ago, she gave a wonderful presentation that led to a very stimulating discussion, Feasting, Fasting, and Famine, Talmudic Disaster Tales and Feminist Food Ethics. So Julia will be our first speaker. And then after Julia, we turn to Michelle Wolfe, another of our fellows this year in Women's Studies, from the History Department at Ohio State University. Michelle completed her PhD in history at Ohio State in 2004, and she was a Dean's Distinguished University Fellow for her entire time there. She has been a summer fellow at the Huntington Library, at Notre Dame's Erasmus Institute, and a past and present postdoc fellow at the Institute for Historical Research. She has presented her work at national and international conferences. She has also published essays on the intersection of gender, family, and clerical identity in Stuart, England, including one recently in the Historical Journal and another in Studies in Church History. While she's here, building on her dissertation research on 17th century clerical families in the Diocese of Chester, Ely, Lincoln, and York, she is currently working on her book project, The Gender Reformation, Clerical Manhood, and Clerical Marriage in Early Modern England. And a couple of months back, I think in this room, Michelle gave her lecture in Women's Studies, The Pulpit, the Altar, and the Phallus, Clerical Masculinity and Religious Conflict in Post-Reformation England. So we have two wonderful speakers with many things to say. And then if our respondent shows up, I'll introduce her, and then we'll have an open discussion. But
actually, Michelle and I have planned to do this as more of a dialogue, so we're going to switch the mic back a couple times. We've identified two different themes that run through both of our work. So I'll give the first part of my presentation, then turn it over to her, and then we'll switch back and forth again. So I want to start tonight by talking a little bit about a text that I'm not going to do a whole lot with, but that is in some ways at the crux of many of the issues that Michelle and I are going to examine. And that's the issue of disability in the Hebrew Bible as it applies to priestly bodies and the situation of blemished priests. So if you're interested in following along on the handout, this is actually on the back side of the handout, Leviticus 21, 16, 23. Okay? Generally speaking, I won't read the full texts. I'll just refer to them and talk about them. You're welcome to peruse the handout if you'd like. And again, if you need a large print version, there is one available. So within the Hebrew Bible, the problem of disabled bodies, the issue of disability as a kind of textual and religious problem, surfaces most dramatically, I think, with regard to the idealized body of the priesthood, of the priests. The central text for thinking about this is Leviticus 21, 16 through 23, a text which forbids a priest with a blemish, a mum, from serving at the temple and offering sacrifices. Now this term mum is not exactly the same. Its semantic range is not quite the same as our contemporary term disability. Okay? But I will often use mum as a way, this term mum or blemish, as a way of thinking about the modern category of disability as it's reflected in these texts. Okay? In the discourse of the biblical priestly writer, the Israelite priests are meant to represent physical exemplars of holiness. Within the context of divine service, their bodies, right, and the idealized perfection of their bodies are understood to be quite important for performing their religious service. From the special lineage that the priests are expected to have, to their intense ritual requirements, there is an extensive preoccupation with priestly perfection. Okay? All aspects of the temple priesthood, or at least many aspects of the temple priesthood, are designed in order to mark out a very select group of servants, idealized servants, as the ones who are able to mediate between God and all the rest of us. Rebecca Raphael, who's a biblical scholar interested also in working with disability studies theory, suggests that the priests in the Hebrew Bible are meant to serve as the visible representatives of God, and that they are physically called to stand in for the unseen, invisible, perfect body of God. The priestly source perceives blemishes, right, physical defects is sometimes how it's translated, as conditions that impair a priest's ability to see and be seen before God and community and to represent this role. Now the texts I want to focus on today are not actually biblical, but rabbinic. The writings of the rabbis, the elite Jewish intelligentsia who formulated rabbinic Jewish practice in the first couple centuries of the Common Era, were very much engaged in biblical interpretation and deriving and developing Jewish law based on biblical texts. So the rabbinic texts I'll look at are drawn from two different sources. First, there's the Mishnah, which is a 2nd century text that's one of the earliest formulations of rabbinic law and practice. Okay? And then second, there's the Babylonian Talmud, which is a 5th, 6th century text that's a very wide-ranging, expansive commentary on the Mishnah that also includes a lot of biblical exegesis, historical legends, and sometimes humorous anecdotes about the rabbis. Right? The Talmud and the Mishnah together really are key cornerstones of contemporary Jewish thought. So in some ways, even more than the Bible or the Torah, they have profoundly shaped the nature of Jewish practice. So thinking about both the legal and cultural norms embodied in these texts is a very important lens for thinking about Jewish practice as it is enacted today. So as I look at rabbinic texts, I am particularly interested in the way that these narratives amplify a critical issue in disability studies. Right? Disability studies theorists, one of the formative principles in disability studies theory relates to the constructed nature of disability. So according to disability studies theory, disability is a fundamentally unstable and socially created category. Even though we tend to think of disability as a sort of objective, natural fact, the thinking here is that there's really a very complex interaction between organic bodily difference, right, and the social meaning of that difference. Right? Certain differences become marked as socially significant. They become often stigmatized and otherized, while other differences are considered run-of-the-mill, ordinary variations, not subject to a particular stigma. So in the rabbinic and legal texts and legends, I want to look at how the classical rabbis use figures with disabilities, use characters with disabilities, and the fact of disability to underscore ideas about the instability and the vulnerability of the body, and to grapple with the experience of physicality, frailty, and the problems of embodiment, the fact that embodiment doesn't always work out in an idealized way. I'll also be looking at the way the Babylonian Talmud thinks about the stare or the gaze, another important concept in disability studies theory, which emphasizes that the act of looking, right, and that intrusive gaze of a viewer is often the critical thing that objectifies and disables the person being stared at. Right? So the stare is a very socially powerful force that is part of how the stigma of disability gets created. Okay, so I want to take a look at some rabbinic texts on disability in the priesthood. But before I do, I just want to remind you, remember that these rabbis are writing after the destruction of the temple, of the Jewish temple in 70 CE, and after the abolishment of the sacrificial system. So all of Leviticus's rules, about the nature of priestly blessings in the context of a sanctuary and sacrificial system, those are no longer valid. Right? At the time when the Mishnah and the Talmud are being composed, though, there's no priests serving at an altar in the temple, and there is, in fact, no more temple. Come on in. Where the priests are in the emerging synagogue. Okay? And so one of the priestly responsibilities is to recite the priestly blessing over the congregation. Right? And so if the priests, when they recite the priestly blessing, are expected to raise up their hands. This may be a familiar gesture to you if you happen to be a fan of Star Trek. Right? They make a particular gesture with your hands. You're not supposed to look at them, and they recite the priestly blessing. This is it's a very charged moment in the service. This is a moment when the blessing is being given over by the priests. Okay?
So Mishnah Megillah 4:7, right, which is a text that's on your handout, again, if you'd like to follow along, describes a prohibition on priests with blemished hands. Right? It says a priest whose hands are blemished may not lift up his hands, may not actually be involved in, he's forbidden from offering the blessing. Rabbi Yehuda says, also, one whose hands are stained with woad or matter may not lift up his hands because the people might gaze at him. This text uses the same term, blemish or mum, that appears in the Leviticus text. But here, the only significant blemishes, right, are blemishes that disable the hands. Right? According to the Mishnah, though, hands that are stained by dye, right, are a kind of blemish. Right? This already suggests to me that we're moving out of a strictly physical conception of disability, right, and recognizing, in fact, that there's something beyond the bodily difference, right, that gets involved in culturally conditioned notions of disability. Right? The Mishnah also showcases the issue of perception. Right? So here we're back to the concept of the stare. Right? The priest is not allowed to lift up his hands. Why? Because people might gaze. Okay? The priestly blessing in the synagogue is a time when the bodies of the priests are supposed to be invisible. Right? The priests, there's all sorts of prescriptions involving the priests being expected to avoid the gaze of those in the gallery. We are not supposed to look at them. Okay? So the disabled priest becomes problematic here precisely because he might catch the eye of the viewers and cause them to look. Or, I'd like to say, to reframe it a little bit, because people's social conceptions of disability might catch them up and cause them to stare. Right? In a critical shift, the text locates the problem in people's stares, not in the priest's body. The Talmudic discussion of this text in Megillah 24b, right, further contests the nature of the disability. At the start of this text, Rabbi Yehoshua prohibits a priest who has a kind of skin disease, probably a visible scaling, from raising his hands in blessing. Likewise, the Talmud claims a priest who has curved or crooked hands, right, is not allowed to lift up his hands and bless the people. So, but just when we think we're heading for a clear enumeration of physical disabilities being linked with the priestly inability to bless, right, Rav Ashi, another rabbi, extends the prohibition and says priests from a certain area are not allowed to recite the blessing. According to Rav Ashi, priests from Haifa or Beishan aren't allowed to bless. What's the problem? They mispronounce the blessing. They say the aleph as ayans, the ayans as alephs. And now we might think this is an issue of speech disability, but remember, Rav Ashi is saying people from these regions, the entire region, right, is out of bounds. This is really an issue of regional accent, right? They're Bostonians with a very distinctive manner of speaking, and Rav Ashi is a linguistic purist and basically thinks they are going to distort the sacred language. Okay? The next portion of the text devolves into a series of ad hominem insults between the sages. Rabbi Chia turns to Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi and says, well, if we are judging on voices here, you certainly would have been declared unfit, right? You're blemished, you're invalid, you're pasul, you shouldn't, nobody wants you up there on the bima. Rabbi Shimon is so upset about this insult that he tells his dad, and his dad comes up with a real zinger. Right? Turns out Rabbi Chia has a little Hebrew pronunciation problem of his own, and he doesn't distinguish between the hey and the guttural chet, right? Which makes a verse from Psalms that actually says, I will wait, chikiti, for the Lord all my days, into a verse that reads in Rabbi Chia's emendation, I will smite the Lord. Now, from a disability studies perspective, I think the shift is fascinating. Because we have moved from a very physically bound conception of disability to an intensely social vision of disability, right? That in many ways challenges the question of whether these guys really are even disabled at all, right? So the text, I think, focuses our attention on the role of stigma, right? And even the significance of insult and retort in both forming and rejecting the image of a disabled other. Now, the final portion of our text consists of 3 cases where a category of priests who would ordinarily be forbidden from blessing, right, actually get a reprieve. Right? They're allowed to bless in a case where the Talmud knows there's a case where they are actually allowed to bless. Right? So let's just look at one example. Rabbi Yochanan said, a man who's blind in one eye can't lift up his hands. But the Talmud protests, there was a guy like this in Rabbi Yochanan's neighborhood, and he spread his hands. What gives? Okay? And the Talmud answers, he was familiar in his town. Okay? In this case, and in each of the cases that follow, the Talmud resolves the contradiction between theory and practice by affirming the general principle, but asserting that if a person was known in a particular town, then he would be permitted to bless, because familiarity diffuses the stare. Okay? They're well known. Observers aren't going to get caught up in that staring business, right, where they're so enamored of the strange, right, that they miss the import of the blessing. In this case, again, we see it's not the disabled body that is fundamentally problematic. It's the disabling gaze. Right? So disability in this case lies not in the body of the priest, but again, in the eye of the beholder. Okay? So I'll pause here, turn it over to Michelle.
Like Julia. Okay. I've done a bit of research on high and late medieval priests and disability, and like Julia's exploration, this does both sort of concern Leviticus 21, and it also is to some degree very much fixed on the issue of the gaze. In this case, the gaze of the laity, and in particular during the Mass. And I have to say, this is very exciting. You're going to hear me mispronounce both medieval Latin and medieval French today. But I'd like to start with what I call the problem of the priest with the pustule. And this is from a 13th century French book of miracles, the Miracles of Saint Louis. And in particular, this is the tale that concerns a French priest named Garmon, who worked in Chartres. Garmon awoke one morning to find his face covered in protrusions, quote, as large as his nose. And as the swellings were, quote, horrible to look upon, he actually physically covered his face with a hood in order to perform the Mass. Now, by doing so, Garmon was momentarily able to escape the gasps and goggling of onlookers. But then some female pilgrims came to speak to him personally about seeing local relics, and forced to uncloak his face in order to talk to them, Garmon had to expose his disability and endure the stares of the women and an intense experience of unfitness for priesthood and shame. Now, this story, I like to say, oozes with medieval notions of deformity, stigma, and the social power of the gaze. But today I want to focus on the fact that it also foregrounds the everyday occurrence in medieval Christianity involving the fact that priests were public performers whose bodies were on regular display. Now, the scholar of medieval literature and disability, Edward Wheatley, in a fairly brilliant book, I think, has pointed to the cultural visibility, this cultural visibility in his discussion of blindness in the Mass. Wheatley notes that both the high and the medieval laity mainly, quote, partook of the Eucharist only through their sense of sight. Now, I think Wheatley may be less than 100% right on this, but the point is interesting nonetheless. Wheatley focuses here on the elevatio. Again, another hand-raising moment, and in particular the moment when the medieval congregation viewed the consecrated bread. Now, without a doubt, Christ's transubstantiated body was the star of sort of the medieval Eucharistic show. But I like to think that the medieval priest was kind of the host's indispensable best supporting actor. His hands lifted the host for the laity to see. His body performed the gestures that gave visual meaning to a ritual which was in part in a foreign language. And thus the church chancel served as a daily stage for the priest in which he enacted Christ's sacrifice. And to a degree, I think one can argue that this medieval performance of the Mass was also a fundamentally masculine act. By wielding the Mass's miraculous power, the priest assumed a paternalistic role in relation to his parish or the laity as a protector and a provider. By performing the Mass's embedded story of Christ's passion, the priest partook in part, it's a lot of P's, in Christ's own spiritually potent manhood. But the question remains, was that manhood transferable to a clerical body that was, quote, horrible to look upon? Could that power be exercised by a man with mutilated hands or weakened limbs? Now, medievalists have long noted that disability and deformity technically barred men from entering the priesthood in the Middle Ages. Scholars have drawn on papal and patristic references to Leviticus 21, and I'm going to give a far less kosher translation here, which declare that, quote, none that hath the blemish shall come near to offer the sacrifices of the Lord, lest he pollute the Lord's sanctuaries. Now, scholars have generally emphasized this notion of pollution and the rather lengthy list of blemishes in Leviticus to mean that the medieval church saw a certain minimal level of bodily perfection as integral to priestly identity, and those scholars include me. But having done a slightly closer examination of late medieval sources, I think this maybe was not entirely the case. From the 13th century onward, papal and episcopal registers record dispensations for ordination despite, quote, defectus corporis, or bodily defect. And when we look at both those records and other texts concerning priests who were blemished post-ordination, we see that the medieval church mainly valued Eucharistic function over unblemished form. Now, medievalists typically cite Title 20 of Gregory IX's Liber Extra as the decisive 13th century canon, categorically excluding disabled men from the priesthood. But after disallowing ordinands with damaged bodies, that titulus, which is quite long, goes on to explore 7 cases of potentially permissible disabilities, many of which are concerned with missing testicles, and I think have a great deal to do with the issue of the defect of sex and ensuring that the priest was indeed a man and possessing manhood. But the other cases turned on the question of whether the ordinand, quote, sine scandalo posse solemniter celebrare, or, quote, could properly officiate without scandal. Dispensations to English and Irish ordinands for defectus corporis consistently refer to this yardstick of proper performance and public scandal as the measures by which they determined if a disability would prevent a man from ordination. So to give you a couple examples, in 1289, the Durham scholar John de Dittenschale could do the manual labors, definitely, associated with the altar and the baptismal font. And thus, after petitioning the Vatican, he was told that they did not view his left ring finger, which had been shortened in a botched surgery for childhood chilblains, as problematic to his ordination. Likewise, and a little later, in 1425, the Irish Bishop of Alet promoted Cornelius Maxerath to holy orders, and the rectory of, oh, I forgot, I'm also going to mispronounce medieval Irish, Ophicari and Bianfada, because, quote, the spot in his left eye was, quote, not so great to give rise to scandal. Records of priests injured or afflicted later in their careers mostly reflect crises where the priest's physical impairment, not a deformity, but an impairment, was preventing him from fully performing the Mass and other liturgical work. And some of this evidence details the lengths at which an ill or injured priest would go to try to recover those physical and sacramental functions. When an English priest, whose name I do not have, with palsy, contracted with Surgeon John Brown in 1381 for treatment, he made payment conditional on the outcome of the surgery, making him able to perform the Mass. And the 14th century abbot of Tournai, Giles Le Moussy, underwent a successful cataract surgery in order to recover his ability to perform the sacrament. Now, one of the duties of the 14th century Bishop of Bath and Wells, John de Drongensford, was managing parishes where the priest was still living, but too old and infirm to carry out his duties. Medieval parish rectories and vicarages were usually lifetime positions, and the priest had a right to those tithes and those profits as long as he lived. So Drongensford had to mediate between the priest's essentially sort of ownership in the property of that sort of parish position with his ability to actually serve his parish. And what he typically did was he appointed a younger priest as a parish coadjutor. So, for example, when John Yunn, the vicar of Cewstoke, became, quote, blind and aged, Drongensford appointed Bartholomew Delamore as custodian, quote, of Yunn's person, revenues, and pastoral duties. Now, I can't tell you what John Yunn felt when age and disability prevented him from serving his parish. However, the date when blindness forced the French abbot, Giles Le Moussy, to stop performing the Mass was so significant, where's my water, that he made a point of recording it, August 14th, 1348. Moussy dictated prose and verse accounts of his experience of visual impairment and cataract surgery. And those accounts, to some degree, really underscore the centrality of the Mass to medieval clerical identity. Describing his blindness, quote, for 3 years or more, Moussy noted first and foremost that, quote, he couldn't celebrate the Mass, nor saw anything except a little light. Discussing the impact of this disability, he lamented in a poem, quote, I do not see, nor can I myself say the Mass, a circumstance that caused, quote, frequent sighing to the heart. Now, Moussy presented his blindness as a providential and loving punishment by God for, quote, my sins and transgressions, which was intended to bring him to penance. So during his 3 years of blindness, Moussy was still a Christian. But it was only when he was sighted that Moussy could say Mass and thus feel that he was a priest. So, like Musée, the probably fictional priest Garmon believed that his supposedly monstrous swellings on his face were the work of God. And, like a good Christian, believing God had marred his face for a reason, Garmon prayed not for physical recovery, but for patience in enduring this affliction. And of course, once he did that, the next morning, Saint Louis rewarded him with a miraculously pustule-free face. Now, Garmon's deformity spoke to the second threat that disability posed to the performance of priestly functions, that is, public scandal, when a priest was, quote, so horrible to look upon that it detracted from the laity's gaze of the Mass. But in actual records concerning ordinands and priests with disabilities, physical functions seem to matter far more than public scandal. What the miracle story of Garmon shared with these records, I think, is the potential annihilation of clerical manhood when disability or deformity impeded a priest's performance on the church stage.
So we've talked about priesthood already, but marriage is another place where disability arises substantially in the texts. In the rabbinic text, disability is featured fairly primarily in the context of marriage negotiations, bridal negotiations. So in the Mishnah, the rabbis are grappling with disability in marriage, particularly in terms of a problem that arises when a woman's blemishes, quote unquote, are concealed from her prospective husband while he's negotiating her marriage contract. Blemishes in this context affect the rights of both husbands and wives, but a legally significant blemish is much more disadvantageous for a woman. Right? So disabled wives have a lot of social stigmas on the marriage market and are considered generally to be both socially and materially inferior to an unblemished woman. I mean, that's sort of the basic assumption that the texts are making. But as I talk about these texts, my thinking about these texts is shaped really both by disability studies theory, but also by queer theory. Rabbinic texts, marriage texts, have a profound fantasy about the ideal feminine body, right? And create what I think of as a very intense closet around the reality of women's bodily imperfections. So in rabbinic marriage texts, the kind of privileged status that is afforded to female body beauty fashions what I think of as the rabbinic marriage closet, whereby one doesn't want to see or know the realities that there might be. It makes strange and different the actual quite ordinary reality of bodily difference and variation. It also heightens the psychic and economic cost of failing to pass as an unblemished body. So when we look at rabbinic texts on brides with disabilities, there's two different conflicting perceptions that are happening in these texts. On the one hand, there's a clear expectation that bridal blemishes will be visible, right? That rabbis and husbands and possibly even other women can look, see, and know whether or not a woman has a disability. But the other reality that's lurking in these texts is a profound anxiety about the fact that blemishes may nonetheless elude the male gaze. Right? So this is the place where I find queer theory particularly helpful, especially Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's concept of the power dynamics and sexual significance of visibility versus invisibility and disclosure versus exposure. Right? So the notion of the closet gets its cultural charge precisely because it's sometimes possible to pass, right? Because there's something that can be hidden. Right? So too, a bride's disability becomes very charged because it might not always be clear, because it might not always be seen. And then a husband will suddenly discover right? He is always at risk of discovering that his bride is not actually the idealized woman that he thought he was getting. Right? So the central rabbinic text on disability in marriage is in Mishnah Ketubot 7:7. Before we look at the text, which is on your handout, let me just outline two relevant background concepts for rabbinic marriage law. Okay? In rabbinic law, marriage is preceded by an act of formal betrothal. And that act could take place, the betrothal can happen years before the actual marriage. Right? So the man and the woman are not allowed, according to rabbinic law, to have sex until the marriage is actually formalized. But during the period of the betrothal, they're already set aside for each other, right? And she will be judged as adulterous if she has sex with somebody else. But the critical component is that there's a potential long window of time between the betrothal and the marriage. The second issue is that when a woman marries under rabbinic law, she receives a ketubah, a marriage contract. And the ketubah specifies a minimum payment that her husband owes her if he dies or if he divorces her. Okay? So the ketubah provides critical economic protections for women, especially for widows and for divorcees. Right? According to rabbinic law, the husband holds sole right of divorce. Right? So he initiates marriage, only he can initiate divorce. Right? But in most places, the ketubah places a lot of limits on the husband's ability to initiate divorce willy-nilly because he has to come up with a fairly substantial payment in cold hard cash if he wants to divorce her. Okay? But blemished brides often lose this protection. Right? So this is the critical issue for women who are judged to have a legally significant blemish. If the husband can successfully claim that the blemish was concealed from him, right, then the bride can be divorced free of charge without her ketubah payment. So you can see that there's a lot economically at stake here. Mishnah Ketubot 7:7 talks about the legal rights of the husband if he finds out that his bride or his bride-to-be has blemishes. So the Mishnah considers two different situations. First, in the first case, right, a husband may have explicitly stipulated that he doesn't want a wife with a blemish. Right? And then he learns after the betrothal that she has a blemish. Right? In that case, the Mishnah rules the whole betrothal is off. The whole thing is invalid. Right? If the man didn't explicitly state, right, that he refused to marry a wife with a blemish, sorry, there's a series of double negatives here, right? Then the marriage still exists, but he has the right to divorce her, and she would lose the ketubah. Right? So in either case, it's quite problematic for the woman who is deemed to have a blemish. Right? But Mishnah 7:7 closes with another tantalizing remark. It says, the blemishes that disqualify priests disqualify women. So our Mishnah here makes a correspondence between the priestly blemishes, right, and bridal blemishes. But this framework of priestly blemishes proves to be, it provides a critical foundation for the rabbis in thinking about what a bridal blemish would be like, but it proves insufficient to cover the full range of bridal blemishes that the rabbis think are out there. Okay? So the Babylonian Talmud's discussion of this Mishnah, this is Ketubot 75a, adds several additional conditions that invalidate a marriage. A woman who sweats, presumably I think to excess, right? A woman who has a mole or a mark, right? Or a woman who has bad breath. This voice jumps in immediately to voice an objection and say that, but these conditions, right, bad breath doesn't disqualify a priest, therefore they shouldn't disqualify women. Okay? But the Talmud then adds a second category, okay, and says that brides are also disqualified on the basis of blemishes that would render an animal unfit to be offered as a sacrifice. So now we've got two sacrificial categories here. Right, on the table. And then because the animal thing also doesn't cover all the cases, the Talmud launches into an extended discussion, this is not on your handout, in which they make clear that they enumerate all sorts of things they find distasteful about women's bodies, including scars from dog bites, harsh voices, wide-spaced breasts, over-large breasts. All of these things are judged over-large breast, quite unbecoming in a prospective wife. So one thing is very interesting to me when I look at the list, and particularly compare it to the list of, they also talk about husbandly blemishes, though they are much less expansive. The concept of female blemishes seems to focus on, certainly not exclusively, but many of the blemishes are visual. Okay? They focus especially on physical features of a woman's body that are thought to displease the male eye. Okay? By contrast, when the Bavli is talking about a husband's disability, okay, it tends to focus, again, not exclusively, but especially on things that involve unsavory smells, especially things that are generated by unsavory occupations. So it seems here that the rabbis imagine women as especially repulsed by bad-smelling husbands, right? And men are particularly led by the desire of the eye. So I find this a very fascinating cultural perception about differences in men's and women's desires. Again, these texts, I think, underscore the very instability and ambiguity of disability as a category. How big or small or off-center can a woman's breasts be before they count as a real and true blemish? Okay? The ideal body, the ideal bridal body, occupies a powerful place in rabbinic thought, but they know they can't pin down its precise parameters. Okay? So even more troublesome legally, though, is the question of when did the blemish arise? Okay? So Mishnah Ketubot 7:8 is the text that talks about this. The first part of the Mishnah, I'm not going to talk about. It deals primarily with the question of whether the husband or the father is obligated to bring proof. Right? This is not relevant to my focus now. Instead, what's interesting here is to look at the circumstances under which a husband can claim fraud if he discovers his bride has a disability. Much rests on the question of timing. If a blemish arose after a woman was betrothed, it's tough luck for the husband. So if she gets betrothed first, and then she develops a blemish, it's tough luck for the husband. Right? The Mishnah describes this as a situation where his field was flooded. Right? Basically, he made a purchase, right? And through unfortunate but legally unactionable circumstances, his purchase, that is his bride, got damaged before he could take possession, and it's too bad for you. Okay? But if the blemish, I mean, the language is just amazing here. It's rife for, yeah, right, the flooded field. If the blemish arose before the betrothal, though, okay, then the husband has a legal claim. Okay? Then he can claim that the marriage negotiation was, quote unquote, a purchase made in error. Okay? That is, he was actively deceived and defrauded, right? Possibly by the woman, but more likely by her father, because the blemish was already there and it wasn't disclosed. But this strategy might not work in every case. The Talmud then talks about the fact that a husband only gets to claim fraud in the case of hidden blemishes, right? If she has a pustule on her nose, right? Then, and he doesn't object when he's negotiating the marriage contract, then it's his own fault. Okay? But even in the case of hidden blemishes, the Talmud suggests he's not allowed to complain if the city has a bathhouse. For the rabbis assume that a husband is going to send his own female relatives to examine the bride on his behalf. This is another rich, it's a wonderfully queer moment in the text, which is generally the Talmud is not sort of full of great lesbian moments. But here, the Mishnah is depicting a culture for us in which women are checking each other out in the bathhouse. Right? Women are expected to either know or be able to learn the intimate details of one another's bodies. Now, since the husband is not legally able to uncover the woman, his prospective bride, before they're married, he has to send another woman in his stead. Right? So through another woman's gaze, the husband first comes to knowledge. Right? These and other texts on bridal disabilities, I think, suggest that a husband's knowledge is deeply intertwined with a very charged, a fraught sexual boundary between his own realm and the world of women. And it's another place where we see disability functioning as a kind of interface between men's and women's relationships in these texts. This is a world to which the husband has to recognize that he has only partial and fragmentary access. Right? And so the texts, I think, offer us some insight. I mean, the rabbis here are using women's gaze in a way that could be profoundly dangerous and devastating to women. I mean, they're basically in some ways conscripting other women to serve as enforcers for their own system. So I don't want to suggest that we have a kind of, idyllic lesbian situation here. But nonetheless, I think the texts do suggest, they hint at the possibility that women's knowledge of each other, right, might serve as, exist as a critical corrective to the rabbi's own ignorance, and a source that can actually foil a man's legal claim to innocence about the truths that women know. So, thank you.
So this is also a story of a hidden blemish in a bride. But it's not a visual blemish. And the fact that it's not a visual blemish, I think, really speaks to the sort of interesting ways that clerical marriage were formed as a social institution in Reformation and post-Reformation England. Now, even before clerical marriage was made legal in 1558, Protestant reformers had already drawn up lists of what they thought clerical wives should be like. George Joy, who was married illegally, in 1541 thought that the perfect clerical wife would relieve the clergyman of all domestic cares. Quote, wash, wring, spin, card, brew, break, sweep the house, make ready her husband's dinner, wash the dishes, turn the spit, nurse her own children with her own breasts. Because, wet nurses are expensive. She should also, at the very best, enhance the clergyman's public image, and at the very least, refrain from soiling his reputation. Now, this is in part due to the fact that traditional parishioners were prone to view ministers' wives, no matter how meek, no matter how pious, no matter how well they turned the spit, as priests' whores. It was exacerbated by the fact that early English clerical reformers had kind of a bad track record with picking wives. The Protestant bishop John Panay was forced to annul his first marriage in 1551 upon discovery that his wife was already married to a Nottingham butcher. Yeah, I know. But they also hoped that clerical wives would be part of the pastorate, the larger pastorate, and enhance the clergyman's image with their own piety. Thus, Robert Crowley, writing in 1550, said that priest wives, quote, ought to be a light to the women all around you. And Joy, who, again, had a very lengthy list of what clerical wives should be like, also said that when they were not turning the spit, they should, quote, visit the sick, sore, and poor. Now, this is a fairly large set of demands already going into constructing this institution of clerical marriage. But as it further developed, particularly in the 17th century, the image of the clerical wife took on new demands, intimate demands, that a wife be intelligent and educated so that she could serve as a pastoral audience and as a spiritual partner to the clergyman. And again, this raises the question of what happens when a clerical wife has a disability. What if she can't turn the spit? And I only have a few sources, and I'm focusing on one today. But I think that the vast number of expectations tied up with a clerical husband's notion of his wife could sometimes disrupt and threaten the clergyman's sense of vocation and self. And this is very true in the example I'm about to tell you about, which is John Rastrick and his wife Jane. Now, born in the early 1650s, the English minister John Rastrick penned this really unique source called, quote, "An account of my conjugal relations, temptations, sins, afflictions, and etc." In manuscript, so this was not widely circulated. This for good reasons. And this account chronicles, in particular, the story of his first wife, Jane, and her chronic mental illness. And it's a very interesting source, both because it details her deterioration in great detail, but it also describes, in fairly developed language, John's own fantasy of the perfect clerical wife. And it goes on quite at length about the ways that Jane's mental illness caused her to deviate from that pattern. In the process, this story of John's marital afflictions winds up constructing Jane's very lengthy periods of intense psychological pain as his personal affliction, his disability, emphasizing the way in which Jane's hidden blemish of her melancholy and paroxysms denied the spiritual and intellectual intimacy that he craved, impaired his pastoral work, and threatened his identity as an effective clergyman. Now, in the early 1670s, when John had graduated from Cambridge and was, out there looking for a parish and looking for a wife, he was, quote, greatly desirous to marry with such a one who was, quote, an excellent, serious, and understanding Christian, a woman that read, wrote, and prayed much, and possessing, quote, good breeding, wit, prudence, piety, meekness, and suitable to my temper and diligence. That's it. Forget about the overlarge breasts. So when this perfect wife wasn't applying her diligence to freeing John from household cares, John would spend time with his fantasy clerical wife, conducting, quote, heavenly conversation, quote, reading and singing psalms and hymns, and engaging in spousal prayer. Now, John met Jane Wilson May 28th, 1670, while he was visiting his aunt in a parish somewhat far from his own. And John first noted, quote, I thought she, who was a minister's daughter, might make me a good and suitable wife. And this is a common theme in stories of 17th century clerical marriage, Hit up the older rector for one of his daughters. She's already good to go, trained, everything. Now, Technically, John knew about her blemish, too, when he first met her. Because when he met her, she admitted that she was suffering from spiritual melancholia. This particular psychological disorder or spiritual disorder was very fashionable in the late 17th century England among young and pious gentry, both men and women. And many prominent late 17th century clerical wives actually met their husbands while seeking consolation and guidance for dealing with their spiritual despair. Among them, Margaret Baxter, Sarah Lamb, Elizabeth Walker, all these people you've never heard of. You're like, what do I care? And many clergymen themselves also underwent episodes, including John, as young men. Apparently, while other people were partying at Cambridge, John was examining his soul in great crisis, which, is obviously to his advantage. So when he met Jane, he wrote, quote, hearing her express how much she would undergo that she might assuredly be God's child, well, it begat in me a good opinion of her. So far from a blemish, John initially saw the spiritual torment as a benefit, as an enhancement. So they married 2 years later, June 25th, 1673. And John was immediately dismayed. He immediately had buyer's remorse. For one thing, she failed to display the intellectual depth for, quote, discoursing about spiritual things, at least at the level John wanted to carry such things on. And then John, his very first night after the marriage, was further freaked out when Jane showed no interest in praying together before bed. He actually dragged her out of bed, forced her into a kneeling position, and was like, we're doing it. So, despite all that, the first couple years of their marriage, he says, were not bad. I'm sure he was enjoying the fact that he could actually have sanctioned sex, and so was she. So maybe that slightly distracted them. But around 1675, Jane started showing new and severe symptoms of melancholy. The first events, according to John, were, quote, dreadful, bitter crying fits without any previous occasion given by any person or outward thing. She also began to exhibit very severe insomnia. She couldn't sleep because of things in her mind. And she was tormented by disturbing thoughts with religious content. However, now, John no longer saw this as sexy. He no longer viewed it as true spiritual despair. Instead, he said, quote, I began to see it was no virtue in her, as I and others before thought. Worst of all, to John's mind, was that she also began displaying irritability with him and their children, behaving, quote, cross and unquiet and unnatural in all her relations. From 1675 until Jane's death in 1684, her melancholy, or mental illness, what you will call it, pretty much afflicted her nonstop, getting progressively worse, with only, a few brief respites of relief for her. And over time, many things about the illness worsened. There was, after a few years, a shift to sexual content in her obsessive thoughts. In particular, she believed that John was cheating on her with their 2 maidservants. Now, John claims that she was provoked by his spiritual relationship with these 2 women, who were, quote, pious and sincere-hearted Christians of a good spiritual understanding and judgment. And he claims that the only reason for her to think this that he gave was that during family devotions, quote, I directed myself in my speech to the maidservants more than her, for I read where I had encouragement to read, and saw an attractive and receptive disposition. Okay, that's what you want to call it. So in addition to this feeling like her marriage was at threat and that people within her own home were undoing her family, Jane also experienced increasing incoherence and distraction, which John described as, quote, looking wildish with her eyes and a carriage that was terrible and frightful. And her misery ultimately culminated in 1683 with an attempt to run away from home, where she then got lost and wandered into a house in a neighboring village and went to sleep on a stranger's bed. After that incident, Jane died the next year of a gastrointestinal fever, and there are signs of possible suicidality in that, as she refused all medical treatment. It's not clear, of course, the medical treatment would work, but nonetheless. Now, for John, Jane was his disability. And from the onset of her symptoms, John wrote that, quote, sad and afflicted was my life. He was repulsed by her melancholic behavior and appearance, and he resented that the illness caused Jane to mistreat him with, quote, undue carriage towards me. Furthermore, Jane's melancholy deprived him of the spiritual stimulation he needed. It forced him to stop, quote, all manner of religious exercises or praying in our family because she could not bear it. And it ultimately necessitated that John's beloved pious maidservants, quote, should be put away, very much against John's wishes. Furthermore, John saw it as profoundly impairing his ability to function as a minister. He said that her melancholy was, quote, a great hindrance to me in my ministerial work. It disrupted his study, it impaired his piety, as, quote, it begat great differences and unquietness incompatible with a holy life. Her worst episodes were always timed to occur on Saturdays when he was trying to write his sermon. And it publicly embarrassed him before parishioners. As he wrote, describing her running away incident, quote, it may be easily imagined what a noise this all would make. And apparently parishioners would joke, quote, the parson's wife is run away and you may run after her. And he said that people believed Jane's claims, interestingly. And, quote, I was talked of as a whoremaster that lived in adultery with these servants. He ultimately had to be reminded by a colleague, quote, it is not your wife that is the burden, it is her melancholy. Now, what did John do to try to help his wife? Well, much like our medieval priests, he turned to prayer. But unlike Garmon, who prayed for patience to endure his affliction, John asked God to modify both Jane and her melancholy to meet his needs. Quote, I prayed that God would free her from her melancholy, enlarge her capacity, and suit and reconcile her with my desires. Which points, I think, to another failure on Jane's part, one he doesn't acknowledge openly, but I think that is there, which is that, as I've said before, clerical wives met husbands often while they were seeking support or help for their own spiritual despair. And there was a romantic sort of flavor to many of these encounters where the engagement with the spiritually distressed woman cast the minister in the role of this sort of pastoral white knight, and he could prove himself to her, prove his clerical manhood, by resolving the woman's spiritual crisis through his consolatory prowess. So Jane's failure to get better in multiple ways diminished John's clerical masculinity and exposed his own lack of spiritual effectiveness, both publicly and privately. What I like about this case is I think it's very good for casting light on both historical continuities and historical specificities involving disability, religion, and patriarchal power relations in marriage. In a very famous book in 1988, Adrian Ash and Michelle Fine noted that disabled women were fundamentally disadvantaged in the modern marriage market, not only when compared to their other female peers, but when compared with disabled men. If a disability occurred after marriage, they experienced more divorces than men with disabilities, and there are more disabled women than disabled men who never marry. So Ash and Fine point this to the fact that marriageability is based heavily on notions of women's attractive appearance and on traditional marriage patterns where wives play the role of caregiver to the husband, but men are not supposed to reverse that role. What I like about the story of Jane and John is that I think 17th century expectations of clerical marriage make Jane's mental illness a greater liability than physical and visual disabilities. And I have other cases of ministers with wives with disabilities, and in particular, a contemporary of John's, Isaac Archer. His wife went blind over the course of his marriage, and he never talked about it in his diary, where he talked about his marriage quite a lot, as a problem or a threat to his pastorate. And he actually spoke very fondly of leading her to church during the week to hear him preach or perform the prayer book. And Rastrick himself spoke glowingly of one of those attractive, receptive maidservants who was both lame and afflicted with seizures. So I think here we have both some continuities with the issue of John being unwilling to play the caregiver, and also specificities in terms of clerical marriage. And of course, there are multiple other ways that 17th century Protestantism mediated Jane's experience, but I'll stop here.
So thank you, Julia and Michelle, for wonderful presentations, very rich, opening our discussion. We usually stop pretty carefully around 7, but we'd like to give good time to our distinguished discussant respondent who's come here tonight, just happens to be in the neighborhood. Let me introduce her briefly and turn things over to you, and then we'll go until we run out of time. Rosemary Garland Thompson is Professor of Women's Studies and English at Emory University. Her fields of study are feminist theory, American literature, and disability studies. Her scholarly and professional activities are devoted to developing the field of disability studies in the humanities and in women's studies. She has published a number of volumes that are relevant, I think, to tonight's topic. 3 of them are edited volumes: 1996, Freakery, Cultural Spectacles of the Extraordinary Body; 2002, Disability Studies Enabling the Humanities; and 2010, Representing Disability, Museums, and the Politics of Display. Those are 3 edited volumes. And then 2 of our own monographs in 1997, Extraordinary Bodies, Figuring Physical Disability in American Culture and Literature. And then 2009, Staring, How We Look. And her current book project over at the Radcliffe Institute, which is why she's in the neighborhood, is entitled Habitable World, Eugenic Spaces and Democratic Spaces, involving critical analysis of how environments composed of built spaces and designed objects that people use and move through determine how the rights of citizen are exercised and by whom. So we're extraordinarily lucky to have you here tonight to complement our rich presentations with your own wise comments. So welcome.
Thank you very much.
It's an absolute honor to be here this evening. Thank you very much for the invitation, for the generous introduction, and for the opportunity to hear this wonderful and interesting new work being done in the context of theology and religious studies. So I'll try to keep my remarks brief, and I want really to talk just about a couple of things. First of all, I think that you probably are quite aware that you have just witnessed an exemplary performance of disability studies, what sometimes we call critical disability studies, sometimes we call it the new disability studies. It's a way of looking at what we think of now as disability as a critical concept, as an identity category, as an historic community, and as a productive cultural concept. And this undertaking in the academic world, in the world of knowledge building, as you well know, is taking place in an interdisciplinary way. That is to say that the critical disability studies ranges across many different disciplines within the humanities, social sciences, and the health sciences, as well as, we hope, what are sometimes called the hard sciences, to make an overall very contemporary academic conversation about the meaning of disability and the politics of disability in the social and cultural world. One of the primary slogans of disability studies, which I think is exemplified very provocatively by the 2 intertwining sets of presentations that you saw tonight, is that disability is everywhere once you know how to look for it. And I think we found that in the close readings as well as the theoretical analysis that was presented this evening. I wanted to call particular attention to the juxtaposition of disability theory or critical disability studies and gender theory and women's studies as well as queer theory as they intertwined and spoke to one another in what we sometimes call comparative identity studies. I think this is one of the most productive aspects of the kind of work, interdisciplinary work that's coming out just now, so that we can use the insights of a variety of different so-called identity studies and critical studies in order to more fully explicate the world that we live in and share together. So this was terrific. I wanted to also suggest that I think one of the most vibrant contributions that critical disability studies across disciplines contributes to our thinking and our knowledge building enterprise is the introduction of new kinds of vocabularies that help us understand, again, social systems, human relations, history, and politics. And I think that
the emphasis in some of these analyses that we heard tonight on social interaction. The term social constructivism wasn't actually used, but it was implied and brought up a number of times. What some of these new vocabularies offer us is a way to understand meaning making in the context of social interaction and relationality in general. And by that I mean, and I'll focus on one of the things that one of the critical moves that Julia was making that is similar to kind of some of the work that I've done myself. So this is why I was able to hear it and find it really interesting, is that she was able to emphasize, I think really productively, the role of perception, of recognition, of legibility, and the role of those functions in social interaction. So what happens is that the meaning of what we think of as impairment, what we think of as disability, what we think of as blemish, to use one of the terms that is part of the discourse in the historical documents that you're using or the data that you're analyzing, the texts that you're explicating. The meaning of disability comes to be constituted through an interaction between what I call body and world. And that shifting of the meaning, social meaning, of disability from what we think of as bodily blemish or lack or deviance, or to use a more historically current term, abnormality or pathology. The meanings, disability gets moved, what we think of as disability gets moved from that spot into the spot of social interaction, so that the meaning of disability comes in particular through its recognition, through what we might call its manifestation in social interaction. I think that's a really interesting and productive critical move that was apparent, I think, in all four of your analyses, and that is particularly productive in disability studies. I want to leave you with one kind of meta-discursive comment, and that is about the term disability itself. I think that many of us have spent a great deal of time, many of us who work in the area of what many of us call disability studies, and I'm being very careful in framing this, about our language. We've considered the language of self-naming, we've considered critical vocabulary, and many of us have decided to use the term disability, which I think of as a kind of intentional presentism. Because, of course, disability is a term that is very contemporary. Especially this becomes apparent when we're talking about these ancient texts, when we're talking about an historical context that is very different from our contemporary moment. And so in some ways, disability may very much jar, and we may get the academic caveat, well, this is presentism. And I want to suggest that this is intentional presentism, and the purpose, and I'm not entirely sure whether you would agree, but I think you might, certainly in my own work, is that disability as a term jars a bit, and that's what we want it to do. Because what we want to do is to invoke the present understanding of blemishes, deviance, deformity, pathology, these terms that are highly discriminatory, terribly negative, and to bring them into the current political moment where the term disability invokes to us the work of the civil and human rights initiatives of basically the late 19th and mid 20th century that continue for us in liberatory movements of all kinds. And so the work of the very term disability invokes this understanding and this reading, and I think it does very particular kinds of politicized and social action work in the academic world and marks that work as such. And this was great. Thank you for the honor of being able to hear what's going on. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be able to be in this larger community for this year. It's great. And I look forward to having a chance to talk with many of you, if you'd like, in our time afterwards. So thank you very much.